How the economy machine works in 30 minutes. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works. And this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economy template. Though it's conventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep global financial crisis, and it has worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made up of few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again, zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create three main forces that drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. Number three, the long-term debt cycle. We'll look at these three forces and how rank them onto of which other created a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spent just like money. So adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you could know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it, that's your transaction. It's the building block of the economy machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So, if we can understand the transactions, we can understand the wider economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all the time transactions in all of its market. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, that of everything you need to know to understand the economy. Everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rate and printing new money. For these reasons, as we see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the rest understood. It's the important part because it's the biggest and most vulnerable part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or car. Or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase the spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns. And every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because know he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has valuable assets to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased income allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing and so on. But this self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something, and how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learned and then accumulated knowledge raises our living standard. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raises their productivity and their living standards faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that isn't necessarily true over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. That is because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when you have to pay back. Debt swings occur in two big cycles. One takes about 5 and 7 years, and the other takes about 75 and 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too up close day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we are going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experience. As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. Since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have a cycle. This is due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. This is due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. Essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future. Then you need to spend less than you make in order to pay back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important, because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy your beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you are promised to pay in the future. Together you and the bartender create an asset and a library. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and the liability disappear. The debt goes away and the transaction is settled. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. Actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion. And the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, if it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to buy your tractor, and the tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standard. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit created growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $1,000 a year and have no debt. You are credit worthy enough to borrow, say on a credit card. So you can spend $11,000 even though you only earn $10,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $11,000. Those person earning $11,000 we know they can borrow $11, so he can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $11,000. His spending is another person's income. And by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. Reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles. And if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to calm down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion. The first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problem. Since prices rise, it raises interest rate. With higher interest rate, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debt rise. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt payments, they have less money left over to spend, so spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop, and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rate, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle. Spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there is an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there is a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finished with more growth in the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people proceeded. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debts rise faster than incomes created the long-term debt cycle. Despite people becoming more indebted, lenders even more barely extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset values are growing up. The strong market lowers its boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets with borrowed money. When people do a lot of debt, we call it's a bubble. So even though debts have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly as fast to offset them. Let's call this ratio of debt to income the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset value is soared. People borrow huge amounts to buy assets as investments, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy. So even with the accumulation of lots of debt, rising incomes, the asset values help borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever, and it doesn't. Over decades, the burden slowly increases, creating large debt repayments. Large debt repayments. At some point, the repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. The repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further. And the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. The burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason. It happened in Japan in 1998 and in the United States back in 1929. And now the economy begins deleveraging. In the deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappear. Asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crisis, social tensions rise, and the world things starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer creditworthy, credit drives up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this while borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets flows the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People fear poor credit, it repeatedly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to recession, but the difference here is that interest rate can't be lowered to save them. In a recession, lowering interest rate works to stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So, the stimulation ends. Interest rate in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debt have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay, and their collateral has lost value. They feel creepily crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think about the economy as being not credit-worthy, just reckon individual. So, what do you do about the leveraging? The problem is that burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. 1. People, businesses, and governments can their spending. 2. Debts are reduced though the first and restructuring. 3. Wealth is redistribute from the haves to the have not. And finally 4. The central bank prints new money. These 4 ways have happened in everyday leverage in modern history. Usually spending is cut first. As we just saw, people, businesses, and even governments tighten their belts and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt. This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debt and start paying down old debts, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the upside happens because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income. It causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. As we've seen, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher employment. This leads to the next step. Debts must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loan, and a borrower's debts are lender's asset. When a borrower doesn't repay, the bank people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them. So they rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed and people, businesses and banks default on their debt. This severe economic contraction is a depression. A big part of the depression is people discovering much of what they thought was their wealthy is really there. Let's go back to the bar. When you bought a beer and put it on a bar tab, you promised to repay the bartender. You promised to become an asset of the bartender. But if you break your promise, if you don't pay him back and essentially default on your bar tab, then the asset he has is to really worth anything. It has basically disappeared. Many lenders don't want their asset to disappear and agree to debt restructuring. Debt restructuring means lenders get paid back less or get paid back over a longer time frame or at a lower interest rate than was first agreed. Somehow a contract is broken in a way that reduces debt. Lenders would rather have a little of something than all of nothing, even though debt disappears. Debt restructuring causes income and asset values to disappear faster. So the debt burden continues to get worse. Like cutting spending, debt reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this impacts the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because employment has risen. Many of the employed have indicated inequalities, savings, and needs of financial support from the government. Additionally, governments create stimulus plan and increases their spending to make up for the decreases in the economy. Government budget deficit explode in the deleveraging because they spend more than they earn in taxes.